In this video, I'm going to talk about the number I. When we would solve quadratic equations such as, let's say we have x squared plus 25 equals 0. We might try to solve this by subtracting 25 from both sides, and then we have x squared equals negative 25. And we say, okay, let's just square root both sides. So then we have x equals, and then we would have a problem. We would have the square root of a negative number, which is not a real number. We would say that there's no solution before we talked about I. Really what we're saying is there's no real solution. And when we talk about I, that's non-real numbers. So now that when we talk about I, now we have a way to talk about non-real numbers. So we will have a way to describe the solution to this equation. So I is the square root of negative 1. That's what I is. So I is really just a way for us to shorthand write the square root of negative 1. And that's really helpful for us when we want to write things such as the square root of negative 25 or the square root of any negative number. We can use I to write it. So let's talk about how we would write other numbers like the square root of negative 25 in terms of I. So if we had the square root of negative 25, when you have a square root, you can split up the inside into factors. So we could say the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1, because 25 times negative 1 gives us negative 25. So the square root of 25 times the square root of negative 1 would give us the square root of negative 25. So now, since we pulled out that negative 1 out of the square root, now we can write the square root of 25 is just 5. We have 5 times the square root of negative 1. And the square root of negative 1 we've defined as I. So we can write 5i. So the square root of negative 25 is the same as 5i. Let's do another one. Let's say we have the square root of negative 3. Now we can split that up into the square root of 3 and multiply that by the square root of negative 1, because 3 times negative 1 is negative 3. So now we can't really simplify the square root of 3. That's an irrational number. Up here, we could simplify it into 5. The square root of 25 was 5. But the square root of 3 isn't a whole number. So we're just going to leave it as the square root of 3. And then the square root of negative 1 is I. So that's the square root of 3i. Now be careful, because this is not equal to 3i. You might think that the square root of negative 3 is 3i. It's not. It's the square root of 3i. And that's because of the reason I just explained. When we split it up, we have the square root of 3 times the square root of negative 1. So we still have the square root over the 3 and then the I. Let's look at now, let's do one more. Square root of, let's see, negative, let's say 72. Now we can split that up into the square root of 72 times the square root of negative 1. And we can actually split up the square root of 72 into factors. So if you have a factor of 72, that's a perfect square. That'll help us simplify the square root. So 9 times 8 is 72. So if we break it up into square root of 9 times the square root of 8 times the square root of -1. Now we have the square root of 9 is 3. And then we still have the square root of 8. So 3 square roots of 8 is how we would say that. I. So that's how we would write these square roots of negative numbers in terms of I. And now that we are able to use I and express numbers in terms of I, we can solve quadratic expressions such as, let's see, let's say we have x squared minus 8x plus 19 equals 0. Well, there's a few ways we could approach solving this. One way would be completing the square, but the way I prefer really is using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula seems scary at first, but really if you can remember the formula, and really you don't even have to memorize it if you have the ability to have notes with you and stuff, but it's honestly not hard to memorize the quadratic formula, and I think it's pretty easy to use because all you have to do is remember what numbers to plug in, and then you're good to go. So if we're using the quadratic formula, our A is going to be 1. Our B is going to be -8, and our C is going to be 19. So remember, the quadratic formula is x equals -b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So if we plug into the quadratic formula, we have x equals -8, which is actually +8, and then plus or minus b squared, so -8 squared is 64, minus 4 times 1 times 19, all over 2 times 1 is just 2. And then we can simplify that. And let's move this down here. So now we can simplify that into x equals 8 plus or minus, let's see, 4 times 19 is going to give us, let's see, 76. So this is 64 minus 76 over 2. So we have 8 plus or minus the square root of, and this is going to be the square root of -8, it looks like. And then divided by -8, right? No, it should be -12. There we go. Okay, -12 and then divided by 2. So I'll just rewrite this since I messed up there. 8 plus or minus the square root of -12 over 2. And then we can write that in terms of I. So this is going to be the square root of 12i over 2. And you actually can simplify that, the square root of 12. So the square root of 12, I'll just do that over here. The square root of 12 can split up into the square root of 4 times the square root of 3, so 2 square roots of 3. So plus or minus 2 square roots of 3 over 2. And we can actually continue simplifying. Don't worry if you're not sure how to do this yet, but we can continue simplifying if we pull out a 2 from the top. We're kind of like doing the reverse of distributing here. So if you distribute this 2 back through, you'll get what's up here. I just took out a 2. So now we can cancel out those 2's, and we get 4 plus or minus the square root of 3. Sorry. This all should have an I. There we go. So we have x equals 4 plus or minus the square root of 3, I. And we can just leave our answer like that with the plus or minus in there. We don't have to split it up because that's the point of the plus or minus symbol, so that we can shorthand that. But this does mean that there's 2 different solutions because it's 4 plus the square root of 3i or 4 minus the square root of 3i, which is 2 different numbers. So that's a little introduction to I. Hopefully that makes some sense. I'll see you in the next video.